You guys have been asking me for months to tell you about the weird stuff that happens in my hometown. And honestly, I've been putting it off because I wasn't sure anyone would believe me. But after what happened last weekend, I can't keep this to myself anymore. Growing up in Millbrook was pretty typical for a small town. Population barely hit 3,000, everyone knew everyone. And the most exciting thing that happened was when the high school football team made it to regionals. But there was always something off about this place that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Something that made you want to get inside before the sun went down. It wasn't until I turned 16 that I realized what made Millbrook different from every other small town in America. The shadows here don't behave the way they're supposed to, and I'm not talking about some optical illusion or trick of the light. I'm talking about shadows that move independently, that seem to have a mind of their own, and that only come alive when darkness falls. The first time I noticed it, I was walking home from my friend Jake's house around 9:30 on a Tuesday night in October. The street lights in our neighborhood were pretty dim, casting these long, uneven shadows across the sidewalk. I was scrolling through my phone when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. When I looked up, I saw the shadow of a mailbox slowly sliding across the pavement, even though the mailbox itself was completely still. There wasn't any wind, no cars passing by, nothing that could have caused it to move. I stood there for probably 5 minutes, just staring at this shadow as it crept along the concrete like it was searching for something. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I convinced myself I was seeing things, that maybe I was more tired than I thought. But then the shadow of a street sign started moving too, stretching and contracting like it was breathing. That's when I ran home and didn't look back. For weeks after that, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was stress from school, or maybe I'd been watching too many horror movies. I even went to the eye doctor thinking there might be something wrong with my vision. But deep down, I knew what I'd witnessed was real. And the more I paid attention during those late evening walks, the more I started to see. The shadows in Millbrook had patterns. They were most active between 9 and midnight, and they seemed drawn to certain areas of town. The old cemetery on Maple Street was like a magnet for them. I'd watch from my bedroom window as dozens of shadows would congregate there, moving in slow, deliberate circles around the headstones. Sometimes they'd form shapes that almost looked like letters or symbols, but they'd dissolve before I could make sense of what they were trying to spell out. The really disturbing part was that these weren't just shadows of objects. Some of them looked like people. I'd see the silhouette of a person walking down the street, but when I'd look for the actual person casting that shadow, there'd be nobody there. Just an empty sidewalk and a shadow moving with purpose towards some unknown destination. My parents thought I was going through a phase when I started avoiding going out after dark. My mom kept suggesting I talk to the school counselor, and my dad would roll his eyes whenever I mentioned seeing weird things at night. They'd lived in Millbrook their entire lives, and according to them, nothing unusual had ever happened here. But I started to wonder if they were just so used to it that they'd stopped noticing, or if maybe they were choosing not to see what was right in front of them. Everything changed the night I decided to follow one of the shadows. It was a Friday in November, and I'd been watching this particular shadow for 3 nights in a row. It always appeared around 10:15 right under the streetlight in front of the Morrisons' house. The shadow looked like a tall man wearing a long coat, and every night it would walk the same route down Elm Street, turn left on Cedar, and disappear somewhere near the old textile mill that had been abandoned for decades. I'd been building up the courage to investigate for weeks. That Friday, I finally grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight app, and slipped out of the house while my parents were watching their Friday night movie. The November air was crisp and still, and the only sounds were my footsteps on the sidewalk and the distant hum of the highway. When I reached the Morrisons' house, the shadow was already there, just like clockwork. Up close, it was even more unsettling. The shadow had depth and texture that shouldn't have been possible. I could make out the details of what looked like buttons on the coat, and the way the shadow's hair seemed to move slightly, as if there was a breeze that only affected this invisible figure. I followed it at a distance, my heart hammering in my chest. The shadow moved with a steady, measured pace, never varying its speed or direction. When it turned onto Cedar Street, I hung back at the corner, watching as it continued toward the old mill. The building had been closed since before I was born, and the chain-link fence around it was covered in rust and overgrown with weeds. But the shadow didn't stop at the fence. It passed right through it, like the barrier didn't exist. I watched it cross the empty parking lot and approach the main building. Then something happened that made my blood run cold. The shadow stopped in front of the mill's entrance and turned around. Even though there was no face, no features to speak of, I could feel it looking directly at me. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, this impossible shadow and me. A scared 16-year-old kid who was way in over his head. Then it raised what looked like an arm and gestured for me to come closer. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get as far away from that place as possible. But there was something else, something deeper that was pulling me forward. It was like the shadow was offering me answers to questions I'd been asking my entire life. Questions about why Millbrook felt different, why the older residents always seemed to be hiding something, and why certain parts of town felt heavy with secrets that nobody wanted to discuss. I took a step forward, then another. The shadow remained perfectly still, waiting for me to make my decision. As I got closer to the fence, I could see that the mill wasn't as abandoned as everyone claimed. There were fresh tire tracks in the dirt, and some of the windows that should have been boarded up were actually clear, like someone had been maintaining them. That's when I heard the voices. They were coming from inside the building, muffled but definitely human. Multiple people having what sounded like a serious conversation. I pressed my ear to the fence, trying to make out what they were saying. But the words were too distorted to understand. What I could tell was that there were at least 4 or 5 different speakers, and they seemed to be discussing something urgent. The shadow was still watching me, still gesturing for me to come closer. But now I could see other shadows beginning to emerge from the building. They poured out of the mill like smoke, dozens of them, all different shapes and sizes. Some looked like people, Others resembled animals, and a few were just abstract forms that defied description. They surrounded me on the other side of the fence, pressing against the chain link like they were trying to push through. I could hear a low humming sound, almost like they were trying to communicate with me. The original shadow, the one I'd followed from Elm Street, stepped forward and placed what looked like a hand against the fence directly in front of me. The moment it made contact with the metal, I felt a jolt of electricity run through my entire body. Images flashed through my mind so fast I could barely process them. I saw the mill as it used to be, full of workers and machinery. I saw the same shadows I was looking at now, but they were attached to real people, living people who worked and lived in Millbrook decades ago, and then I saw how they died. There was an accident at the mill in 1967, a massive fire that started in the chemical storage room and spread through the entire building in minutes. 43 people died that night, trapped inside when the exit doors jammed. The official report blamed faulty wiring, but what I saw in those flashes told a different story. The mill owners knew about the dangerous chemicals they were storing illegally. They knew the ventilation system was broken and the emergency exits hadn't been maintained in years. When workers started getting sick from the fumes, management covered it up. And when someone finally threatened to go to the authorities, they made sure that person never got the chance. The fire wasn't an accident. It was set deliberately to destroy the evidence and silence anyone who might talk. Those 43 people didn't just die in a tragic workplace accident. They were murdered to protect a handful of wealthy families who controlled everything in Millbrook. As these images flooded my mind, I understood why the shadows were still here. They were the spirits of those workers trapped between worlds, unable to move on because their deaths had never been acknowledged. The town had buried the truth along with the victims, and for over 50 years, these shadows had been trying to tell their story to anyone who would listen. But here's where it gets even more twisted. The families responsible for the cover-up are still running Millbrook today. The mayor, the police chief, half the town council. They're all descendants of the people who orchestrated the mill fire. And they know about the shadows. They've always known. The humming grew louder and more images flashed through my consciousness. I saw midnight meetings in the basement of City Hall, where current town leaders discussed how to keep the truth buried. I saw them performing some kind of ritual every year on the anniversary of the fire, something that kept the shadows contained to certain areas of town so they wouldn't spread and attract outside attention. That's why my parents and other longtime residents acted like nothing was happening. They weren't oblivious to the shadows. They were part of the conspiracy to ignore them. The whole town was built on this lie, and everyone who stayed long enough eventually became complicit in maintaining it. The shadow in front of me pressed harder against the fence, and suddenly I could hear its voice, clear as day, speaking directly into my mind. It told me its name was Robert Chen, and he'd been 24 years old when he died in the fire. He had a wife and a baby daughter who never learned what really happened to him. His family was told he died heroically trying to save others. But the truth was he'd been locked inside the chemical storage room and left to suffocate. Other voices joined his. all the victims speaking at once, telling me their names and their stories. They showed me where their bodies were really buried. Not in the official cemetery, but in unmarked graves behind the mill, where the town founders dumped them to hide the evidence of how many people actually died that night. The official death count was 43, but I was hearing from at least 60 different voices. 20 more people had been killed and their deaths completely erased from the record. People who didn't have families to ask questions, mostly migrant workers who'd come to Millbrook looking for steady employment and found only death. As I stood there listening to their stories, car headlights suddenly swept across the parking lot. The shadows immediately scattered, melting back into the darkness like they'd never been there at all. I dove behind a dumpster just as 3 black SUVs pulled up to the mill entrance. Men in expensive suits got out, along with people I recognized from around town. The mayor was there and the police chief and Mrs. Henderson, who ran the historical society. They unlocked the mill doors and went inside, carrying briefcases and what looked like old leather-bound books. I stayed hidden for 2 hours, watching as they conducted some kind of ceremony inside the building. I could see shadows moving behind the windows, but not the same shadows I'd been communicating with. These were different, darker, more aggressive, and I could hear chanting in a language I didn't recognize mixed with what sounded like screaming. When they finally came back out, their faces were pale and several of them looked sick. The mayor was clutching his chest like he was having trouble breathing, and one of the men in suits was bleeding from his nose. Whatever they'd been doing in there had taken a physical toll on all of them. As the SUVs drove away, the original shadows returned, but now they seemed more agitated, more desperate. The shadow of Robert Chen approached the fence again and showed me one final image. A date circled in red on a calendar. November 15th, 3 days away. That was the anniversary of the mill fire, and apparently it was when the town leaders performed their annual ritual to keep the shadows contained. But something was different this year. The ritual was getting weaker and the shadows were getting stronger. They were planning to break free from whatever supernatural bonds had kept them trapped for decades. And when that happened, everyone in Millbrook would finally learn the truth about what this town was built on. I ran home that night and didn't sleep for 3 days. I tried to tell my parents what I'd discovered, but they just looked at me with these blank expressions and insisted I must have been dreaming. When I mentioned the mill fire, my dad actually got angry and told me to stop spreading rumors about respected members of the community. But I knew what I'd seen and heard, and I knew that in 3 days the shadows would be free to tell their story whether the town wanted to hear it or not. That was last weekend. November 15th came and went, and something definitely happened that night. The power went out across the entire town for 6 hours, and when it came back on, things were different. People are starting to ask questions about the mill. The Historical Society's records mysteriously disappeared, and 3 members of the town council have suddenly decided to move away from Millbrook for health reasons. The shadows are still there, but now they're not just moving at night. I've seen them during the day, growing bolder, reaching out to more people. And I'm not the only one who can see them anymore. The truth is finally coming to light, and there's nothing the town leaders can do to stop it. After 56 years of silence, the victims of the mill fire are about to get the justice they've been waiting for. If you live in a small town that feels like it's hiding something, pay attention to the shadows. They might be trying to tell you something that the living don't want you to know.